right. Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Logistics with Purpose. Kristi, how are you doing today?
I am good. I am currently in Vermont, and so I am enjoying a beautiful, it is mid-October now, so I am enjoying the beautiful fall colors and all that Vermont has to offer. So I'm doing well. You just got back from a conference. How are you?
Just came back from the Break Bulk Convention in Houston, Texas, and I'm doing great. Thank you very much for asking. Atlanta's starting to get a little bit colder, which is always fun and nice. Great grilling weather. And today
Yes.
we have an amazing guest, so we're very excited for that too.
Yes, we are thrilled to have Ryan Honeyman. He is the partner slash worker slash owner, definitely sounds like an owner's title at Lift Economy, the co-host of Beyond the Bee and Next Economy Now podcast, and author of the B Corp Handbook, which I have read, and it is how you can use business as a force for good. So, Ryan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We are
Ryan, thank you. Yeah,
delighted.
it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. You have a lot of fascinating insights to share with our audience. But before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, I'm going to ask you some quick questions and you just respond to with the first thing that comes to your mind, okay?
Sure.
All right. So early bird or night owl?
So early bird because I started meditating and I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old and I have to do it early. Otherwise it just won't happen.
Makes sense. Favorite book besides your own?
So I can't think of like a favorite, but I will mention one I'm reading right
Okay.
now is really good. It's called Crossing the Unknown Sea by David White. It's about David White's a poet. And it's about like finding your purpose at work through the lens of like poetry. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, that is
Yeah.
cool. What's something that it never fails to inspire you?
Gosh, I think my kids, because like I said, 7 and 10, and they can just be happy and in the moment, and it's inspirational to actually like play Uno with my kids or like, board game and things like, oh, I don't have to worry about the world at large. I
Yes,
could just be here.
that's good. And if you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Gosh, I'd probably say to ask the power to not have my kids ask me, I'm bored, what should I do, over and over and over again, because I can't help but getting annoyed by that question.
I'm sure a lot of parents would echo that. And what is one thing you can't live without?
Um, my wife.
Good. Good answer.
Good
We'll be sure to
answer.
send her
Really,
the
really good answer. Yes. No, it's great, and yes, kids that age are fun and inspiring, and I wish like more of us could be a little bit more like them. I'm certain that the world will be in a much, much better place. So enjoy.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you.
Ryan, so well, thank you once again for sharing some of that with us, and thank you for your answers. Now tell us a little bit more about your background. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, and a little bit more about how your childhood was.
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Central California in Fresno, if anyone knows California. So Fresno, it's an interesting place. It's conservative country in California. And so I really grew up with like a lot of agriculture and, conservative politics around me, which is very interesting. But then I went to UC Santa Cruz, which is like the total opposite, sort of like very liberal school. And through there, my original path was to get into criminal justice reform and really look at how do I reform the prison system. And so I worked for a few years in that field after college. But as many folks know, the criminal justice system can be very depressing place to be. It's like catching people pretty far down the path of like things having gone wrong in life for them and for others. And so my brother had studied environmental studies in college, and I read a couple of his books around probably 2009 or 2010. Like there's some classic books like Cradle to Cradle. It's like how do we remake things? There was another book called Natural Capitalism. And those were like how to use business to inspire and solutions to, social and environmental problems. And I got really inspired to say, hey, maybe I could do, going green was like, in like early
Right,
2000s, it was like going
right.
green. So that was those days. And yeah, I sort of convinced the nonprofit executive director I was working for to let us try to make us a green nonprofit. And so I was doing like sustainable food and maybe lighting retrofits and new things to positive impact. And how I made the shift into the B Corp world and kind of what I'm more doing is through that environmental sustainability, social work, I found out that there was this, group of companies that were certified as B Corps. And I said, oh, that could be cool. Maybe I could help companies do B Corp certification. So this is around 2010 or so. And I started a solo consulting business. And yeah, so around then I started looking into getting involved in the B Corp movement.
I feel like 2009, 2010 sounds like so far back there. And I feel like we all believed in different things. Like it was literally a different world. So it was pretty early for kind of like such an amazing move, right? I mean, it's more logical
Yes.
now compared to back then.
Right.
Yeah. And, I am in the Bay Area, so it's maybe a little more of the like, you pull
Right.
tread some things,
Right.
but also it was not, companies were not generally thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You mentioned both, obviously the environmental aspect, but also growing up around an agricultural area there in Central California. So was, even if going green wasn't on your mind, was there something in your early years that shaped kind of like now looking back, looking at the lens of, oh, this kind of made sense about how I kind of eventually took this path?
I think there was a part of me that always felt like I couldn't just work a straight 9 to 5, but like lose my soul, like just only for money. Like I just couldn't do it. And so I didn't quite know what that meant back then. I think it was like, psychology or towards the criminal justice system. It was like that sort of emphasis, but then that wasn't quite the right fit for me. And I think it's more now in the like business for good sector. But yeah, I was just determined. I was like, I can't be one of those people who's like 60 and is like, like, why did I just only make money? Right. And so I really wanted to try to do something meaningful.
Yeah.
So you went to UC Santa Cruz, as you mentioned, and of course, then you also had something at London School of Economics. How did these two organizations kind of influence your perspective around this topic and about your career path?
Yeah, well, I tell a lot of students or younger folks will come to me and say, "How did you get into what you do, and what should I do?" And I often say, whatever your degree is in school, and I don't know if either of you have similar experience, you don't have to do like what your degree says. It's like
Yeah.
I was
Despite
I
the
was
money you've spent on it. Yeah.
yes. So I had a degree in psychology, and then I did a master's in criminal justice policy.
Wow.
And I at London School of Economics, which were both fascinating, of like learning about private prisons and military contractors and criminal justice. It was all very interesting, but it's completely not super relevant to what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
So I would just say, yeah, for folks who are also like, don't feel confined to your whatever your degree is in before to try something new. It's more, for me, it's like connecting to your passion. And I would say, like, if folks are in that space of feeling like how to actually make that leap, there's a few books that I read that were super helpful. One was What Color Is Your Parachute, which is like a classic job. It's like a job career meaning book. So that's one thing I recommend. And there's a newer one called Designing Your Life, which is, I think, written by some Stanford graduate school professors. But it's sort of like the process of making that shift rather than just saying you want to do something.
We'll definitely put those two links to the podcast so that people can follow and actually read those books. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
I mean, they seem to be like in very different areas, but is there anything that you can probably extrapolate from both? Any connections between the criminal justice and saving the planet?
Yeah, I think there is an element of like psychology that is for both. So for criminal justice, it's like, why would someone, or how does the system impact the individual, and why do certain individuals make certain choices? And I think for sustainability and environmentalism, we can throw climate change data like, these many hectares of trees are lost and this many CO2, but it still sometimes doesn't connect with people. And so I think there's also like a psychology of how do you really bring people along for systems change and individual change that I'm really fascinated with.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's like one thing I've really found out is that empathy and understanding and being on the same team with someone, even if they disagree with you, is like really critical to actually making any change. And so I think those are some things that maybe is a little bit of a through line, is like trying to understand how people really change and how to move systems.
Fascinating. Yes, I agree with you. Well, you've done so many interesting things, and you were also trying to, of course, help a place go green that you were already in. So, but eventually you decided to start your own thing. So now you have the Lyft economy. So what gap is it that you started seeing and why you wanted to start your own thing? And tell us about your mission.
Yeah. So right when I was 2010 or 2011, when I started it was a solo consulting business called Honeyman Sustainability Consulting. So it's a very straightforward name.
Yes.
But what I found was that a lot of companies needed a little bit of help at the time. It wasn't like any one company needed a full-time person quite in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this belief that like, hey, maybe I could do a really low overhead work from home single person consulting business and provide services to lots of different companies in a way that could provide a good enough income.
Yeah.
I didn't have kids then either, so that
That helps.
maybe it would be different.
That helps a lot. Yes.
Yeah, and I think my wife had health insurance through her job, so there were a few things that
Yeah.
were aligned. But yeah, uh, I actually just lost my train of thought of where I was going. Maybe we could probably edit that part out. But
Okay. So you saw
Don't worry.
the gap that you saw was that people needed help but didn't need somebody full
Yeah.
time.
Yes, thanks. And so I started, helping companies with the B Corp certification. And at the time, I will say that I felt like finding the B Corp community was sort of finding your people, right? It's like, wow, all these people that think alike and they're dynamic and it's exciting. It's a movement. So for me, I still have that feeling about the B Corp community. And I will say that so I met some of my business partners at the Lyft Economy team around 2014, after I'd been doing my solo business. And, what some of the stuff they were talking about is, you know, how do we completely redesign the economy and worker cooperatives and regenerative agriculture and permaculture and some of the things I was like, what? This is like,
Yeah.
I had really discounted those things as too fringe, as like cooperatives or like regenerative ag or permaculture. What is like, it seems to me, I was kind of dismissive of it a little bit because it seems so little. But I think I've learned more that there is an important role for some of that work to play to like inspire and like move these larger players. And so I see it more as it is necessary to have some of that really forward leading edge things that are, sure, it's not like Walmart is going to be a cooperative or something, but it's like if Walmart adopts regenerative agriculture practices, sequestering carbon in the soil, that's really helpful on a large scale. And so I think that's part of the through line there.
Yeah.
Well, at Lyft Economy, you also created, you started Lyft Economy, and then you also created the Next Economy MBA. What is the MBA? What is this program about, and who is it for?
Yeah. So the Next Economy MBA, we started it in 2018, and I think around that time I had read The Lean Startup, if any of you have read that book. And so, one of the things with the Lean Startup, for folks who haven't read it, is just put up a website for something, make it an offering. Maybe you haven't even created all the materials for it yet. You think like, hey, this could work. And then allow people to like register for it. And then if enough people register, then you're like, okay, there's a market demand and maybe I'll actually create the course. So we had been speaking to entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs for a while and doing consulting projects with them. But a lot of them still lacked some of the fundamentals of, vision, culture, strategy, operations, some of those, like someone might be very purpose driven, but have no idea how to do their financial model,
Right.
or no idea how to hire the right people. And so the Next Economy MBA, we put up this website, and we said, I wonder if anyone would sign up for something like this, because we're excited about it.
Yeah.
And I think we got like 50 people signed up, and we're like, okay, we should actually create the course material. So it's a 9-month course, and we offer it twice a year. And it's not a traditional MBA, but it does cover some of the fundamentals of business, like the vision, culture, strategy, operations. But also it gets into some of the next economy ideas. So like open source or regenerative, or there are discussion about how do you set up a cooperative if you wanted to, or how do you do the gift economy, things that are just a regular MBA program doesn't really look
Right.
into, because it would see that being too weird.
Yeah.
And the reason we call it an MBA is actually, we were like, should we call it MBA? Because it's technically not like you get a degree from a degree granting institution. But then there's a few marketers, like Seth Godin had the alt MBA. And so I was like, okay, well, if other people are
Right.
the alt MBA is like 30 days, so we can call it an MBA too.
How many classes have you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kristi.
Well, I was going to say you're teaching people, but what have you learned,
Right.
especially in throwing up a website, getting a good response, and then building it out?
I've learned that, it's a great way to really suss out market demand. And, so there can be a little bit of, you got to be strategic about it. I will say, like, we don't quite do that the same nowadays. Like, just throw things up there. It's like, okay, we'll do a little bit of market research first, rather than just like completely throwing things up. But yeah, we've had, it's on cohort 14 is coming up
Nice.
in the spring of 2025, and we've had about 500 or 600 people take the course over the last few years. And so yeah, I'm happy to share the link, and if anyone's interested.
For sure. No, if anyone that's listening is interested in something that sounds incredibly interesting, please go ahead and follow the link and sign up. It's not exclusively for companies, so anyone as an individual, even if they're not related to this, they can sign up and go through it.
Yeah, so you could be someone who's just starting out, like maybe a student, or someone who wants to take that next step. You could be someone who's like launched a business, or is about to launch one, but is sort of needs more of a grounding. Or we find that people who want to change careers will also come and take the course to really sort of get their skills up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and shifting gears a little bit, we've been talking about the B Corp movement, but there are still people out there who had never heard of it. So you mentioned how you stumbled on it as well. So can you start by just telling us your perspective on what it is?
Yeah. So the B Corp movement started in 2007. And the original idea was, how do we create a movement of for-profit companies who are using the power of business as a force for good? So, Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, King Arthur Flour, Allbirds. I think there's around 9,500 E Corps around the world in 100 and, well, I think maybe 90 countries, but 140 industries. So it varies quite widely. Definitely lots in the supply chain, and I think you all said you're the first logistics company, though, right? Is that
headquartered in the U.S.? There are, I think, 4 or 5 total globally that are certified.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so a couple of things that make a B Corp. So one is you have to take an online assessment to measure and compare your score, and so you have to get a verified score. Currently, it's above 80 points on a 0 to 200 point scale. And so that will be changing, though, in 2026. So depending on when you're listening to this, the new standards will be changing. But the first component is, get that verified high score. Second, you have to meet the legal requirement. So it means incorporating some language and purpose into your foundational governing documents. So your operating agreement, or your articles of incorporation, which I can talk about in more detail if folks are interested. And then the third is you have to have a public profile on the bcorporation.net website so people can see your score transparently.
Yeah, I always hear those three things described and I'm like, man, it sounds easy until you try it.
Yes. How long did it take you all to finish yours?
A couple of years, but we also
wow.
were in the pandemic queue, as I call it, where it was just such a backlog that they had so many requests they were trying to get through. So, but it was a long process. And I definitely say that I know more about the company now than I ever wanted to.
Yes, totally.
Very, very thorough. Definitely recommend it to everyone out there that's listening,
Yeah.
right? We had to change a lot of things. We had to understand a lot of things of who we were and why we were doing certain things. So at the end of the day, it was not only getting the certification, but I'm very confident that we became just a better organization going through it. As we said before we started taping this episode, we would have loved to have you. And I've met you before, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
And just for everyone out there listening, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Patagonia is at a 152 out of 200. So it's
crazy.
very, even if Patagonia doesn't get close to 200.
Yeah. Yeah, there is one company that recently got above. I didn't think getting above 200 was possible, but Dr. Bronner's is at 206.
Wow.
Oh, wow. That's a big
And
shout
so,
out to them.
I love that product.
Yes, they I feel like there's a certain confluence of events that you have to get that high of a score with like be closely held company and have maybe the original founders and like not external investors that are also wanting more profit. So there's a couple of things, but that's only for the very highest score. There's actually a ton of B Corps that have investors and are publicly traded, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Well, with your extensive experience kind of working and consulting and supporting and helping all those different companies become B Corps, you mentioned a couple of names. I'll just repeat them because it's very impressive, like Patagonia, Allbirds, Ben and Jerry's, King Arthur. What challenges do they share? I mean, what are some of the same things that they're going through, that they're struggling? What can you tell us a little bit about your findings? About those companies as well.
Yeah. I think, every company is just sort of operating and trying to do the best they can with just a bunch of different priorities going on at any given time. So I think with E Corp, one reason people really like it, and maybe this was your experience, is it can just be a way to say, okay, like here's somebody who's really put some thoughtfulness into what it means to be an environmentally and socially responsible company. And I can just go through it systematically and try to meet some of the standards. So that's one thing, is like even Patagonia is still just like doing, running their business. And then like, oh, the economy's tight. Like, do we have to lay people off, or like, how do we open this new store? And then they're also balancing their social and environmental issues as well. So that's pretty common across companies. I'll say definitely for the companies that we mentioned, they're all in supply chain, right? Like they all have a product or and so it's like suppliers, are we, as you're sort of lifting the lid a little bit on your supply chain, I think it can be scary for some people. I mean, like, I really hope I don't find something in my supply chain that's like not, that's like, Patagonia is actually, it's good about this. They found that one of their tier 2 suppliers was taking the passports of the workers that worked there and like forcing them. So it was like sort of like a modern slavery situation in their supply chain. And then they also found that the down feathers they were getting for their puffy jackets were coming from it was like a company that was like, they were like force feeding them to like grow their livers, because that's like a delicacy. And then, of the geese. And then they were like live plucking the feathers. So Patagonia was like, oh God, we got to stop doing that. So I do think there's like, as more companies look at, how do we look into our supply chain and, we don't just want to turn our eye and be like, I don't even want to know. Right. I think B Corp is a good way to partner with other companies who are also looking into their suppliers and really looking at ethical guidelines fair treatment of workers, et cetera. So I think it's a great community for that sort of best practice sharing for folks.
Yeah.
It's refreshing to hear like some of these examples because some of us, at least me, actually hold all these companies in a such a high standard
Yeah.
status that you forget that they make mistakes too. They have actually screwed up things as well. And I mean, from what you described, I think the main difference is that they acknowledge it openly, candidly, and then they do something about it to change it, which is probably where most companies kind of like stop trying.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
I think famously, Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, was saying that he noticed that his employees in a lot of his stores, I think in the 90s, were getting sick all of a sudden and having headaches. And he realized that it was the clothing that they were buying came from like cotton that had a lot of pesticides on the cotton, and it was sort of off gassing into the stores and making their employees sick. And so that's when they decided to shift to organic cotton. And so I think it's like, how do you take the quote unquote mistakes or mess ups, but then say, hey, if we acknowledge them and think about what we can do differently, then, I think the shared learning is really beneficial to the company and to the broader community.
Absolutely. And probably the other side of that is we all respect them more. It's hard to be the one to
Right.
step forward and say we made the mistake, but when somebody does, you really respect them a lot more for that because they're admitting it and then changing their actions as a result. So that's fascinating. We did a great job explaining B Corps earlier. So you were not employed by B Labs, let's state that, but you did actually write the book on it called the B Corp Handbook. I read it. It's great. It gives a terrific overview. As I said, I read it after we certified. I wished I had read it before and known about it. It also has many assessments. I love that at the end of the chapters and examples from not just the US, but from global examples of how it's in practice, how it's been beneficial. So why write the book?
Yeah. So, we also were talking before this episode started recording about, you know, 99% of people, maybe a little more now, but it is pretty low of like, hey, if you say, what is a B Corp to the average person on a street with a, like a microphone,
Right.
they probably don't know. Although you could say like, if they're under 30, like maybe they're under 20, they might know a little bit more, but still. So I think for me, especially in 2010, 2011, 2012, and even 2013, it was like people were like, what are you talking about? Like, what is this B Corp thing? And B Lab has had a decent website, but it was like a lot of dense information. You had to click around. And there's a cultural phenomenon with a book, right? If you have a book, people are like, oh, now I can like
Right.
understand it because it's
Right.
like I can hold it in my hands and like look through it. And so I realized that in order to really help, explain the challenges of like what is a B Corp to people, that it would be a great idea to write a book. And a key component of that would be like highlighting the stories and making it practical and actionable for people about how to do it rather than just a theoretical book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fantastic and gives people kind of mile markers on so they can figure out where they are in the process and if this is the right one for them. It was also recently or a few years ago updated in 2019, revised. You have another one already planned. So why?
Yeah. Well, one nice thing about the B Corp movement is you don't just certify and then you're good for the rest of your
Right.
company. You have to recertify every 3 years. And as part of that, B Lab does update the standards. They used to be updated every 2 years, and then it went to like every 3 years, and then every 4 years because it's a lot of work to like
A
update the
lot of work.
standards. And now they're doing a complete redesign of the standards, called the Evolution of Standards, which is coming out in 2026. So, folks want to learn more about that. There's, well, I did, maybe I'll shout out my podcast, the
Yes,
Beyond the B
please.
podcast.
Please.
Yeah, Beyond the B. It's a podcast about, what's working and not working in the B Corp movement, how to improve your impact and more information on the new standards. So if anyone's sort of like what's coming with the B Corp standards, check that out. There's a couple episodes on there. But yeah, I think the sort of gist is, there's a lot of changes coming, and um, still really inspiring and powerful movement, but understanding some of the big changes, I think, will be critical to a lot of folks getting on board and adopting the sort of new standards.
For sure.
Absolutely. And as you said, right, it's a lot easier when you have a book, when you have something to kind of like really put in front of you, even if it's like an electronic book or an audiobook, but something that actually highlights everything.
Yeah.
With your extensive experience, like with the podcast and the consulting, you have all this amazing information from all these very inspiring companies. Do you mind sharing one or two kind of examples of all the different things you have learned throughout the years? Like maybe something that is either inspiring or funny or just interesting?
Yeah. Well, the two of you may relate to this and other folks in the podcasting world, but having a podcast has been one of the best decisions we ever made as a company, because we interview people that would otherwise never talk to us. Like, for example, I will go to a conference, and if I'm like, hey, I'm a consultant, and blah, 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 they're like, yeah, whatever. I hear 100 consultants. But if it's like, hey, I have a podcast, I'd love to interview you. They're like, oh, well, let me. So one funny story is, do you all go to Expo West in Anaheim? It's like the Natural Products Expo.
Yeah, I haven't been.
So Natural Products Expo West is the largest like natural products, and there's a lot of B Corps there and mission-driven companies, and it's in Anaheim and like around March of every year. And there's like 80,000 to 100,000 people. It's crazy. They take over the Anaheim Convention Center. There was the cool thing about Expo West is that the founders and like the CEOs of the companies are at the booth often. It's not just like their marketing person or an intern. And so I believe it was Organic Valley, which is like a really large, socially responsible B Corp. I don't know if they weren't a B Corp yet, but like dairy farm. I think they're in Wisconsin. And there was this big long line of like 20 people to talk to the CEO. And we sort of went to the booth and we're like talking to one of the marketing people, and we're like, oh, we have a podcast we want to interview. And so she said, oh, you do? And so she took us in front of the line of all 20 people and said, oh, these people have a podcast, and put us to the side. And like, we got to talk to them a little bit. It was kind of embarrassing. I was like, I don't actually need you to have us cut the line. So that was like one sort of funny podcast nerd topic.
Yeah.
But
awesome.
I will say, like, yeah, looking under the hood from some of these companies that are, really trying to make a difference, and like how they balance those things. Like Allbirds, which we worked with, a lot of their wool comes from New Zealand. And then they also have a product that's made from like tree fiber. And so looking under there, like at how they measure, okay, so they have all these sheep, and they're like getting the wool and then like shipping it, to I think China or something, like to manufacture, but then you also have this tree product, and then looking at the carbon footprint from those two things. And it's just really fascinating. Like as a consumer, you just see like a shoebox or like a store, like an Allbirds shoe, but to really sort of get a little bit more of like how the sausage is made, for some of these companies, I think has been really fascinating. And I wish companies were more transparent about some of the ways that they do these things, because I think it could be a big, way to connect with consumers and be more educational for folks. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, as we said, go ahead, Kristi.
No, I was just saying that's a lot of ground to cover. I was just thinking, like, I was visualizing the route when you were talking about that. And yes, of course, that's one thing our audience knows well.
Yes.
So I had another question regarding the certification and we talked a little bit about how extremely rigorous it is and how much time it takes, and of course how good of a job you and other companies that help B Corps get certified are doing. After the process is done, of course, you get a lot of the questions as of so we did it, we have it, what's the ROI, right? So it's one thing that it's purpose. How do you have that conversation with your clients? How do you address those concerns? How do you then separate, I guess, follow-up question on the first one. So first one is, how do you address it? How do you talk about ROI with your clients after the certification? And then the other one is like, what are some of the best strategies out there to really capitalize on the value beyond being, of course, a purpose-driven and responsible company?
Yeah. Great questions. Usually when someone asks that, I'll kind of say, I'll ask, ask a question. Like if I get asked a question, I'll ask a question back. I might say, like, what is your goal in 5 or 10 years? Because B Corp is not an end in itself. It's usually a means of getting to something. And a lot of the companies in the movement, us and you all, et cetera, we're not, it's not like we're just getting B Corp and then that's it. It's like we're all trying to do something. Is it grow? Is it capture new market share? Is it attract and retain the best people? Is it, make the company more aligned with our values? And so once someone says like, well, okay, in 5 to 10 years, we hope to double in size or maybe, reach out to these new markets, then it's like, okay, well, here's how B Corp could help you get to those things. So it's a little bit more tied to the long-term vision. Um, but I will say like the most common ROI benefits are things like, you know, it has historically been, it's up and down, but it has historically been pretty hard to hire the best people. And so a lot of, especially, younger generation, millennial, Gen Z, et cetera, want to work for socially and environmentally conscious companies with a purpose. And a B Corp is a great way to attract and retain that young talent. So that can often be a huge positive ROI for folks. Another thing that's typically pretty impactful is differentiation market. You were the first logistics company headquartered in the US to be a B Corp, right? So that's a great market differentiator. Any purpose-driven brand or B Corp that's looking for a logistics provider might search the B Corp directory or, search for B Corp certified companies. And so you can kind of capture some of that mission aligned market, which are probably going to be better customers for you, honestly, because, they're going to be companies who already are aligned with your values. And so maybe they're a more long-term partner. So I think differentiation and attracting and retaining talent are some of the big ones. And then I would just say it's not really like you couldn't point to this as a direct ROI, but I think the community, and maybe the two of you experienced that a little bit at the retreat in Vancouver. It's just like very exciting and dynamic and it feels like home sometimes. It's like, oh, like,
It
wow.
does. Absolutely.
It's like these people, there's people like this out here. And it's hard to really say like, oh, that's worth 10% year over year growth or something, but it's really like something our soul needs as people, I feel like, is that community
I
component.
think you're absolutely right. I mean, what's your take on that, Kristi, since you and I were both really excited to be there? I mean, what's your take
I
on
think,
being in
there
Vancouver?
is a lot of conferences, you pay your airfare and your conference ticket and you show up and things like that. I feel like at the retreat, like you already started with this understanding of how hard everybody worked to be in that room, because it wasn't just you buy a ticket and whatever. We were pursuing that path for 2 years. And so I felt like that was just a lot of cool common ground. And also like everybody you talked to had a great story and they're trying to like the creativity of how people are trying to solve the world's big problems, whether it's, a new product or a service or just the creativity and how people are accomplishing that is always so inspiring. And so, we didn't even spend that much time together at the conference, but then we would meet up and we'd be like, did you hear about so-and-so? Did you
Yeah.
meet so-and-so? And so it was such a, yes, I don't know that you could actually put that into concrete terms, but from that perspective, it was a lot of fun and really just, kind of, you're like, this is why we did this. Yeah.
It's exciting to see that a lot of companies are going in that direction, right? So at some point, I know that it's not easy to put like an ROI on that, but at some point it will be one of those things that if you don't have it, then you won't even be considered.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, that's kind of like where we're heading, but thank you.
Yeah. And just to see how many, I forgot what the number is, it's huge, there's a number of people that start the certification but never finish it. But then there's also just a number of companies that just use the impact assessment for their own benchmarking to see where they are and where they can improve. And I think that's really valuable as well for, as you said earlier, not just to turn a blind eye or to wonder or to whatever, but actually look at some sort of metric that they can evaluate themselves with. Um, Well, I'm curious, you've been around the community for a long time, not only with your business, the book, hanging out and having clients, but how, and we were even, again, talking about this before we started recording, how do you see the business landscape changing because of B Corps? We've seen momentum, certainly in the US. It's been around here a long time. One of the things which you started in kind of the Beehive networking group was like, why is this growing so fast in the UK? It's
Right.
just like a rocket ship there. They've also, of course, announced other, areas in Africa and Asia, and they're, coming up with new models and ways to do this around the world. So how do you see this shaping the business landscape, and any predictions you want to share?
Oh, wow. Well, I think it is shaping the business landscape. I mean, you have large multinationals now really looking to do this. I've worked with a couple large multinationals who are really trying to be one of the first global, companies to do this, who have like multiple subsidiaries in different regions, and they're sort of making progress. But you've had like Unilever and Danone really saying that they want to be doing this. I will admit there's a little bit of like depression or frustration with like Unilever's situation, like sort of, new CEO, and like suddenly their shareholders are like really coming back. So I do feel like there's still some issues we need to work out in this social business movement around just the expectations of like investors and the sort of culture around maximizing shareholder value. So you have the benefit corporation legal structure, which is supposed to protect companies from that. Unfortunately, Unilever, even though they own several B Corp subsidiaries, including Ben and Jerry's and Seventh Generation, are not Unilever is not a B corporation at the corporate level. So that would have been an interesting case study of what happens if your corporate level entity, even though it's publicly traded, is a benefit corporation, so that you could push back against people trying to cut out all the benefits. So I do think the sort of the shift is coming. It's just, I think the time frame that I hope, like I hoped it was like, okay, once B Corps take off, it's just like a pure like hockey stick or like, growth trajectory, but it's not, unfortunately. It's like, in the US we have anti-ESG, anti-woke, some in the last 18 months have been kind of rough for the ESG movement and sustainability, but in Europe it's like going way more than we thought it would be. So I think it's B Corp is really a part of that and influencing it. It's just I might have to adjust my expectations as to like how long it will to really shift culture to like make those changes.
Yeah, for sure. Any predictions?
Well, I do think the new B Corp standards are going to be pretty powerful. One prediction is I think it's going to be the standards are pretty tough, right? So one prediction is going to be there's going to be some very tough decisions for some companies to be like, are we really going to make this change, or are we going to drop our certification? And I hope it's not, more than like 5 or 10% of the community, but I do think it could be a good chunk of companies are just sort of like, we don't want to continue to meet these standards. And so the community might have a little bit of a contraction, but I'm hoping that's temporary to then grow farther in the long term.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And we're all very interested in seeing what will happen, not only with the movement, but with I guess the world around us. I'm pretty sure that this episode's going to be released after the US elections, but there's a lot of things riding on that decision as well. So please, I hope everyone voted. But no, you're absolutely right. And it's an interesting future. I really think, and going back to maybe your kids, right? You said there was 10 and 7.
Yep.
I'm very confident that I'm almost sure that they will make decisions based on companies that are more purpose driven. So again, I feel like it's coming. We can debate a little bit as of when it will happen, but it will reach a tipping point at some point, and it will be for the better. And that's basically going to be thanks to all the future consumers that are being taught by parents like you. So
Thanks.
finally, and call of action to all those companies that are considering becoming a B Corp. You probably have these conversations with a lot of your clients. What do you tell them? What do you like to tell all those companies that are out there listening to this episode, or maybe even reading the book or ready to make a commitment? Couple of
Yeah.
words of wisdom.
Yeah, I would say, for folks who are interested, you can go to the bcorporation.net and you can take the free B Impact assessment. You don't have to decide to certify or not. It's a great tool to just measure and compare your performance. And yeah, I'm happy to speak with folks as well. We're at lifteconomy.com. We have the Beyond the B podcasts. We have the Next Economy Now podcast. So there's a lot of great resources out there for folks who are sort of wanting to go deeper on the topic. But yeah, I would say reach out and take the next step.
Yeah. And before we go, just tell us briefly what each podcast, like, do you have to be a B Corp to listen to Beyond the B? What is
Great
the Beyond the
question.
B and the Next Economy Now?
Yeah. So Beyond the B is it's sort of our B Corp nerd podcast. So you don't have to be a B Corp. It's just like we tend to go into things that it's sort of a deeper dive. So it's like, how does the verification process work at B Lab? Or, why is B Lab UK growing so much, and like really taking time to dissect that. So it's kind of for folks who really want that extra level of depth for B Corp. Next Economy Now is a broader podcast for the leaders who are using business as a force for good to redefine success in the economy. And so it's things like, like how is regenerative agriculture affecting the economy? How are cooperatives and different forms of new governance structures working in the economy? So it's much broader than just B Corp, but it does include some content on B Corps.
Cool.
Ryan, thank you very, very much for being here with us. It's been a pleasure, a masterclass in many different levels. How can our listeners contact with you and, of course, learn a little bit more about the Lift Economy and what you guys do?
Yeah. So folks can, lifteconomy.com, LIFT economy.com. And then you can email me, Ryan at lifteconomy.com, if anyone has questions. And happy to reach out. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, but not so much on the other platforms. I feel like once Twitter would change its name and sort of went a little downhill. So I try to focus more on LinkedIn than the other ones.
Sounds good. All right. Well, again, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate all you're doing to help further the Business as a Force of Good movement. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for being here. And we will have another terrific episode in 2 weeks. So we'll see you then. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.